And may the peace of Yahweh truly be with each and every one of you. We'll be going over chapter 20 tonight in the 14th book of Israel, part 1. And this is the planned genealogies of the kingdom number 3. This is the breeding program, the spiritual guidance Yahweh placed in the genes. And this sermon, it opens up with, they had a video that was played. And in the video, it was explaining the way that DNA works. And we'll just highlight a few parts of it. It was talking mostly about whales. And it said in the second paragraph, to survive, a whale must know how to do things. This knowledge is stored in two principal ways in the whale's genes and in their very large brains. We can think of the genes and brains as something like libraries inside their bodies. And of course, the reason why Pastor wanted to bring this out and to show this is not so much about the whales, but to help for us to understand how things are passed on through genetics. You know, and when you go to study these things in the world, you know, of course, you get into the science in the world, and they always want to make out like this was done over a trillion years, you know, when the amoeba started to turn into the jellyfish that turned into the bird. And, you know, so you got to be careful that when you're looking at things that the world produces. Remember, the world does not understand the plan of Yahweh, and they're deceived by these various deceptions. So if you look at these things without that information, you could also be deceived into thinking, you know, some of their knowledge is accurate. But the reason why, you know, like I said, Pastor wanted to bring this about is to show us, you know, what Yahweh had put into the breeding program. He says, we can think of the genes and brains as something like libraries inside their bodies. The information in the DNA, the genetic information, includes how to nurse, how to convert shrimp to blubber, how to hold your breath on a dive 1 kilometer below the surface. Now, this is an important part. He says, the information in the brain, the learned information, involves such thing as who's your mother or what's the meaning of that song that you're hearing. Now, that's important because there's two different types of information there. There's the stored information, and then they said that the information in the brain that is able to change. And then that would also go into the DNA. He said the gene library of whales and people and almost everyone else on Earth made of DNA, the only function of this complex molecule is to store and copy information. So he says, we see here in a set of instructions in the human DNA written in a language billions of years older than any human tongue. Well, of course, they're referring to evolution, but, you know, nobody really knows exactly when Yahweh was starting to put this plan together. It could have been, you know, billions of years in the making. I'm sure it was. You know, when you see how much detail Yahweh has put into this breeding program, into this plan, and that will become more and more clear as the sermon goes on, you know, what exactly is being spoken of here. But on page 271, in verse 2, he says, this is after the film got stopped, and Pastor says that you know, you can see how we are wonderfully made, just as David was inspired to write. And then in verse 3, he says, he had it planned from the beginning. That's Yahweh. He had it planned from the beginning. And you remember that, you know, remember he's talking about this genealogy. And if you go back and you know, you reread, you know, Yachanan 1 through 5, and you see that plan, and you read those words and take those words seriously, he says, it had planned from he had it planned from the beginning, and we've got to believe that in order to understand all the things that have taken place. So what Pastor's trying to get across to us is that we have to believe that all these things were a part of Yahweh's plan. This bloodline was a part of Yahweh's plan. Us sitting here tonight is a part of Yahweh's plan. We have to believe that. And you know, the more clear we can of course, through studies, you ought to be able to make that pretty clear to yourself. But, because the House of Yahweh has taught this since its establishment, and we have now all that information to fall back on and to research and to study. So we ought to be sure on the facts that we stand on, and that we need to believe this in order to understand the things that have taken place. We've got to believe that nothing has occurred that is concerning this line of breeding. He guarded it very closely all these years, for 6,000 years now. And remember that the creation of man and the work of Yahweh is not just a 6,000 year, he didn't make it up 6,000 years ago for no reason. This plan is to put an end to all suffering everywhere. So it's very important to Yahweh. And he wants us to understand our significance in that plan, because we fall short when we don't see our significance in that plan. When we forget why we're doing the things that we're doing, we're subject to all the temper tantrums and whatever else. We get distracted by sin, by the cares of this world, whatever it may be that's trying to distract us. Your mind has to get back to this plan, because it's the most important thing there ever was. This is the plan that stops all suffering, not just on earth, but throughout all of creation. And what's important for us to be able to realize is just what a little bit of sin, a little bit of yielding to sin will bring. Because it starts there, and it's hard for people to comprehend that. It's sometimes easy for people to understand that, we should live a more moral lifestyle. But everybody wants to try to justify whatever little sin they want to hold on to. And it's important that we go through all this. This is the plan of Yahweh. He's showing, not only to us, but to heaven, to earth, to all the beings, what takes place when a little bit of sin is yielded to and accepted. And we can see that in full force right now. But he's also showing what takes place to a group of people that he calls and teaches, and what can be done there also. Because it's a remarkable work. When we think of, I remember, when I first came to the House of Yahweh, and I thought, well, why in the world would he pick me to be? It's not like, Yahweh went out looking for people who, did the right thing and said, okay, I'll take him, It's not like we did something growing up that was better than our neighbor, and he said, okay, well, drop the neighbor, I'll take this one. This was his plan from the beginning, and it was planned to call certain individuals. And that is where we're at right now. We've been given, and what it means to be called, we're going to get into that further in this sermon. But it's truly an awesome thing that Yahweh has done here. And, to see the opportunity that we have in front of us, we need to be redeeming every second of every day and having our mind focused on why it is we're doing the things we're doing and what it is that we're doing here in the House of Yahweh. And what are we putting into our genes for future generations? Because this work doesn't stop here. It's not like this group of people is it and then everybody else is cast out. No, this group of people will continue to grow forever. So the things that we put in our genes through our own actions, through our own thoughts, the thoughts that we accept, the things that we feed ourselves, are going to be passed on to future generations. So we owe that obligation to the future generations, because that, we're not going to be there if we're not guarding what's coming into our mind. We won't even be there. But you can see how awesome that this whole plan is, and the way that Yahweh created this, and what we can see here, and what He gives us to see in the Scriptures. But in verse 8, down at the bottom, he says, Genesis 1 reveals a lot of the DNA and how the mind was made. In verse 9, he says, the mind is the one thing about the body that can be altered and can be added to and actually be changed in a feeding process. So, the way that DNA stores certain information about individuals. And, the Peaceful Solution talks about this. There's certain traits that we cannot change. Our eye color, our hair color, how tall we are not, or whatever. And all those things are, just part of our DNA that make us, individuals. And, our mind and what we're born with and what we start with, that is also passed on. But this is the different thing about the mind, is that the mind is the one thing about the body that can be altered and be added to and actually be changed in the feeding process. So again, we have to fall back on what it is that we're feeding our mind with. We're taught over and over and over again to be rehearsing sermons and all that, which is absolutely, essential to be able to get some of these topics. You can't just study this once a week and then expect your mind to retain it all. It has to be a constant rehearsal. Think of all the various things that you forget that throughout the day. Our mind is like that. If you're not constantly reminding yourself, or if it's not in the forefront of your mind, you're going to forget it. So this feeding process, what we feed it, what we're feeding our minds right now can also be put into our offspring, as you could also gather from this film right here. And that's what he wanted you to see from that film with the whales and all that. This is part that can be changed. And when we feed righteousness or feed Yahweh's laws into this, and humility is huge. Humility is huge in changing your DNA and changing the mind. Humility is huge. And in fact, Yahweh says, without it, you can't do it. You have to develop humility. And I say you, and I mean me and us. We all have to develop humility. And to really, really strive at that. If you want to set goals for yourself, set goal to be the most humble person that you could possibly be. You cannot be too humble. You can't be overly humble. Yahweh is not going to cast you out of his kingdom because you're too humble. No, as a matter of fact, Yeshua said, unless you humble yourself, you're not going to enter into the kingdom. Remember? So that's something that we always have to be reminding ourselves, because that pride wants to buck up at times, and we really do think that we know something sometimes. But if it's one thing that we do know and that we should know, is that Yahweh is the only source of power, truth, and information, right? So he established this house to feed us, to feed us, to change us, to allow us to become the full potential that he wants us to be. And that is done through the teachings of the House of Yahweh, through our overseer, the one sent to bring us to this state of perfection. And the more that we humble ourselves and accept those instructions, the quicker we grow, and the sooner we achieve what it is that Yahweh has set out to accomplish within each and every one of us, which goes back to the beginning there in Genesis 1:26. So he says, humbling ourselves to accept Yahweh's laws. And then this also goes into our offspring, and it can be bred into them. Now, let's turn the page to 272 and look at verse 11. He says, and then, if we get further enough in this today, we'll actually see here that Yahweh allowed certain people to be killed off to keep their bloodline out of Yeshua's. And this is to show how closely Yahweh guarded this plan, this bloodline. And we'll go through several examples in this scripture, but sometimes, we forget. As much as we like to remember that Yahweh is in full control, sometimes we forget that, and we can fall victim to fear, which could lead to making bad and poor choices. We have nothing to fear in the house of Yahweh. Everything that looks scary and ugly in this world, it is. It's ugly, it's scary, it's this and that. But Yahweh is in full control, and if he does not want a hair on your head to be touched, then a hair on your head will not be touched. If you remember that, go back and read about Daniel, read about what took place, and picture yourself being put with a bunch of hungry lions for the evening, and think of how that might make you feel, right? Well, Daniel had his trust in Yahweh. The great prophet Daniel had his trust in Yahweh. And I know that we do too, but this is something that we really, really have to establish, because we cannot allow ourselves to be, the judgment that we live by is the judgment of Yahweh. And we can't let anything get in the way of that, in that decision making. But he says, keep their way of thinking and their pride and so forth out of Yeshua's bloodline. He was guarded, that this thing was guarded so closely. And if you look at the importance of this plan and what Yahweh has proven to not only us, but to the heavens and the earth, you'll see why this is so important. And it's like, it's truly remarkable to actually have a part in this plan. Could you imagine, you don't have to imagine, it's real, but think of it, that Yahweh called you to help him prove a point, to show when a person is taught by Yahweh and sits in Yahweh's counsel and receives that instruction, that even the most ridiculous of people, even the lowest of characters, if they're willing to humble themselves and hear Yahweh's words, they can be changed. And this gives us hope. This is a real hope. This is not, something like you see politicians talk about where they're going to change everything and they're going to change this and everybody's going to be better when I'm elected, And then they get elected and nothing changes because they don't even know the way to change it. Here we are learning the true way to not only bring peace and joy and abundant living to our own lives, but to share that joy with others, to bring other people to be able to enjoy life as well. And that is the true reward here that we seek is this peace being taught to everyone. Think of what an awesome world it would be if everybody lived by these laws. Think of how it boggles your mind to stop and think about what daily life would be like if the whole world was keeping Yahweh's laws. Remarkable. Remarkable. All the things that we stress about, is due to all this wicked system that they've created. I really do look forward to all that being done away with. But now look at verse 12. He says, now in verse 18, since Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation. Now notice what he says. He says, now this is not just speaking of becoming a nation at that time. In fact, it has nothing to do with that time except for the multiplication, because Yahweh, from the multitudes that he brought through Abraham, has chosen 144,000 out of that multitude. This is the mighty nation that he's referring to there, which will walk with him, that will walk with Yahweh, and walk as Yahweh, to be by his side, and to rule as Yahweh rules. And of course, Yahweh is completely merciful and just and fair in the way that he rules. And if we're going to be ruling with Yahweh, that's how we have to become ourselves. And we do that every day. And a lot of it, I always, start to reflect and consider these things coming up to Yeshua's memorial, is the service. The service that we do and considering one another. We have to be concerned not only for ourselves, but for every single individual in the house of Yahweh. We have to be that concerned with every other individual, just as if it was our own flesh that was suffering the things that our brothers are suffering. And when we get there, we'll see the character of Yahweh. Because Yahweh is very concerned for his creation. And that's the reason we were created, to help all of creation. So in verse 14, he says, we can prove this. I'm in the middle of the paragraph there at the top. He says, we can prove this because of the fact, like I brought out from the beginning, that this is an actual fact, that these things that Yahweh taught to our first fathers are still with us today. Now he's talking about those who are teaching evolution and how this just spontaneously took place. And he's saying, well, no, we can prove that Yahweh is His plan is real and it's true. And he says the fact that these things that Yahweh has taught to our first fathers are still with us today. It's called the Book of Yahweh. It's still with us today. And as much as they've tried to stamp it out throughout history, it's still with us today. Isaiah 34:16. Remember the great Book of Yahweh. Not one of them will be neglected. Now, in verse 19, he says, consecrate. Remember this. Consecrate and sanctify yourselves, therefore, and be holy, for I am Yahweh your Father. Now remember Genesis 1:26, and remember that it's Yahweh's plan. Genesis 1:26, but it's in Yahweh's plan to make man in His image. So he's telling him here, consecrate. Separate yourself from sin. Separate yourself from the world. You know, it ought to be very clear to the people in the world that we're different. And it is. It is. I've worked in the world long enough to know that people see within a really short period of time there's something different about us. They can't always put their finger on it. You know, there's something different about you people. You know, a lot of times people think that they have to preach sermons to people when they go out to work. And it's... If you conduct yourself the way that you've been trained in the house of Yahweh, you will have preached the most powerful sermon you can preach. You know, you don't have to try to get somebody who has zero understanding and then try to impress them with all the great knowledge that you've learned here and try to explain to them about the clean and unclean laws or all the, you know, the things that just look at you and say, okay, this person's crazy. You know, they're not ready for that type of information. Of course, the peaceful solution is very easy for everybody to understand, and it's absolutely undeniable. And if you want to open up a great conversation with somebody in the world, that's a perfect way to do it, because you could talk about those things, and you could talk about it in a way that they're able to comprehend it, right? But again, unless you're conducting yourself the way Yahweh's taught us to conduct ourselves, that's just wasted words, because they'll look at that and say, yeah, but look what you do. You know? Hypocrisy will never be allowed in Yahweh's kingdom. It's just not going to be there. So that's a very important thing that we have to establish within ourselves is that self-control. You know, and remember to conduct ourselves the way that Yahweh has taught us to conduct ourselves. Now, in verse 22, he says, elect according to the foreknowledge of Yahweh. So, according to Yahweh's plan, in other words, the Father through sanctification of Spirit Holy or by Spirit Holy, which, remember what Spirit Holy is. Remember Yachanan 6:63. Okay, so it's through these laws that, you know, this is done. We need to turn the page to 274, and we'll look at verse 29. He says, well, and this is a pastor talking about Yahweh. He says, well, He is slowly changing you. He is slowly. Remember, this was back in 1996. He's saying Yahweh is slowly changing you from that to a spirit being like Himself. That is, a spiritual line of thinking like Himself. A holy people thinking holiness and governing against thinking anything that would bring harm to yourself or someone else. That sounds familiar, doesn't it? That's what we need to be on guard of. He said, now with that in mind, you can read, now you also as living stones are being built, being changed up into a spiritual house. And remember, that's one of the laws, that we build the house of Yahweh. And that's not, you know, necessarily talking about pouring concrete and framing buildings, even though that's a part of it. You know? That's a part of the buildings, and it's a great work. But building the house of Yahweh goes back to that care and concern that we have for one another. and urging one another on to righteous works. Urging one another on to righteous works. So it's our obligation to urge one another on to righteous works. Not to tear down, not to belittle, not to mistreat, not to abuse, but to urge one another, to encourage one another, to be there for one another, to accept correction when it comes, to humble yourself. That's what building the house of Yahweh is all about. Praise Yahweh. Now, in verse 42, he says, let's go back to Genesis 21 and notice Genesis 12, but he says, Yahweh said to Abraham, do not let it be distressing in your sight because of the boy. And let's skip down. He said, whatever Sarah has said to you, listen to her voice, for in Isaac your seed shall be called. This word called here, it's the root for it is to call out to address by name. So Yahweh is going to address this particular group of people by name. Okay, those who are bidden to call forth, to name them. To name them, and that's what the word called means. It means to preach to them, to teach them. We are the called out ones of Yahweh. We are taught by Yahweh here in the great house of Yahweh. And this is awesome because we see the great power of Yahweh displayed right here in front of our eyes. Daily here in the house of Yahweh. And that's what it means to be called. Now, if we turn real quickly to page 276, and let's look at verse 50. He says, while we see, on the other hand, Yahweh building in his family this love and peace, this is going to be in the minds taught by the 613 laws being accepted into the mind. Okay, so this is how this works. You have to accept these 613 laws into the mind in order for it to be changed. You have to humble yourself and to examine yourself and to look and see, is the way my mind thinking right now, is it in line with those 613 laws? And if not, what do I got to do to correct myself? Let me find help. Where can I find help? Yahweh provides it. Yahweh provides it. Yahweh gives it to us in abundance here in the great house of Yahweh. Now, for the last thing I read here, let's go to page 277 and look at verse 56. He says, Yeshua answered and said to him, truly, truly, I say to you, unless a man is reborn from above, he cannot see the kingdom of Yahweh, or not enter into the kingdom of Yahweh, being reborn of Yahweh. Through this work of the Spirit Holy, through the acceptance of the laws of Yahweh into his mind, to change the mind, to bring it to this chain that will never, that will ever exist in you. So that's building us up and leading us up to, the great plan of Yahweh and the fulfillment of this plan and our role in fulfilling this plan. But this time, if you all please stand, I'm going to turn the services over to the great Khan, Matithia Hawkins.
Praise God, great Khan. And Shabbat Shalom, men. You may be seated. May the peace of Yahweh be with each and every one of you. We're going to pick up here where the great Khan Kifa left off here in chapter 20 of the 14th book of Yisrayl, part 1. We're going to be picking up on page 278. And before we continue back in the book of Yisrayl here, we just want to read here, if you want to write down for your notes, in Psalms chapter 8. Psalms chapter 8, verses 1 and verses 4 through 6. Psalms 8, verse 1. How excellent is your great name in all the earth, Yahweh our sovereign King. You have your glory firmly set above the starry frame, the heavens. And verse 4 through 6 says, what is man that you are mindful of him, and the son of man that you visit him? For you have made him a little lower than the Malachim, but you will crown him with glory and honor. You made man to be the ruler over the works of your hands. You will put all things under his feet. And we want to continue to keep that scripture in mind as we go through here, because Pastor is showing us here in these sermons on the genealogies, the planned genealogies of the kingdom. This is the third sermon he gave on it here, given July 6, 1996. And this one was entitled, The Breeding Program, the Spiritual Guidance Yahweh Placed in the Genes. And we're going to see here, we're going to pick up here in verse 63, and we're going to see here how these inclinations towards righteousness was actually placed in our genes, okay? Were placed in Yeshua's genes and also placed in our genes way back from our forefathers. In verse 63 it says, "You know, I told you years ago that mankind's mind is capable of retaining, that is, the subconscious mind, the part that we can't use yet. It's not given to us yet, but we will have use of it when Yahweh determines if we get this wheel complete, to where it turns and don't bump when it goes around." And Pastor's laughing, or you remember he said that Yahweh's brought us here to his house to be made into the image that he wants us into. So whether that's a round peg or a square peg, Yahweh's hammering us into this image that we need to be so that we can be used by him throughout all eternity. But if we get this wheel complete and Yahweh gives us the use of this subconscious mind, then we will have a giant computer. And remember, this is the promise that Yahweh gives us, that if we overcome the desire to sin, if we choose righteousness and we continue to practice righteousness, and we choose to humble ourselves, to lower ourselves, to serve our fellow man, to serve Yahweh's work, then Yahweh actually is promising us this great use of the subconscious mind. But Yahweh, it says, when Yahweh gives us the use of the subconscious mind, then we will have a giant computer. They claim that all the computers in the world cannot house or contain 1/10,000th as much as the mind of a person. In fact, there seems to be no limit on the mind, what it can contain. If you remember in the There Is Someone Out There book, Pastor went into great detail showing about the complexity of the human mind and how great it is compared to a modern-day computer. In fact, there seems to be no limit on the mind, what it can contain, and the more you feed it, the better it is. It doesn't wear out. In fact, it builds on what you feed it. It either builds or it deteriorates depending on what you feed it. But this word gene now that Yahweh has used, this substance, this cell of which everyone contains a full library, as Carl Sagan put it, that was in that film clip that was covered here in the beginning of the sermon. Each of these cells going into your brain, if you could think of the many billions of libraries that are already in your brain at this time that you can't even use, because it's not given to you at this time to use, but one day soon it will be. Okay, so we see that we're actually proving to qualify for the use of our mind, the part of our mind that Yahweh hasn't given us use of. Okay, and if you remember why Yahweh held back the power of the subconscious mind, why it's not given to man, because without proving and qualifying that you can use it properly, and control the use of it, then it would actually bring great destruction. Remember what Pastor said before about, you'd actually be able to destroy people or buildings or countries or nations or even worlds or planets, just through a thought. Remember Yeshua said, that's why Yeshua said, he who's thought it in his mind has already committed the act. Showing us how we have to govern our thoughts, hence why we need to diligently, strive to put on Yahweh's perfect righteous character by learning the peaceful solution here from Yahweh's house, that we be able to govern our thoughts so that we can qualify for the use of the subconscious mind, and then so when we get the use of it, we won't bring any harm or damage, and we won't have to face, as Pastor showed last week, we won't have to face, the Malachim that are set to guard things, and they have no deviation from their instructions. If someone steps out of line, they'd actually be put to death because they would cause a great deal of confusion and wickedness. So we see here that every one of the cells in your brain contains billions of libraries. Okay, and if you kind of think of just a library, like a library filled with books, I guess would be, or you could even think of like the Yisrayl Says software if you've ever used it. You have a vast amount of knowledge, information that's stored and can be used and it can be pulled from, very rapidly. And in our brain, every one of the cells in our brain contains billions of libraries. And so you can see, as Pastor said right here in this verse 63, it seems to be no limit on the mind what it can contain. And remember, Yahweh's plan is an eternal plan, and we will continue to learn throughout all eternity So you can see how complex Yahweh made our minds to where we're going to be able to actually continue to build and store and retain knowledge. And this is why it's important that we feed our mind, righteousness. Remember Deuteronomy 30, 15 through 19, about choosing righteousness, choosing life through righteousness, because as Pastor said, depending on what you feed it, you can either build it or you can deteriorate the mind. Okay, now picking up here on page 279 and verse 71, Pastor's talking here. He was reading Yachanan 3:13, and then he goes on here showing the definition of the word son from the Hebrew word ben. This word is listed on page 121 of the Hebrew English Lexicon of the Old Testament by Brown, Driver, and Briggs, which shows that the word means a son succeeding to a father's will, just as Isaac was so bred by Abraham and Sarah, because they were trained and all the genes put into this big wheel in the mind, and of course this was passed over to Isaac. So Isaac then, just like the perfect bird dog, would yield to the laws of Yahweh. This was his biggest joy, his greatest joy. Okay, so we see here the training that Abraham and Sarah received, okay, and the training process they went through. If you remember, they were, Sarah was 99 years old when she gave birth to Isaac. If you remember, this training, okay, was actually passed to Isaac, who yielded to the laws of Yahweh, which were his biggest and greatest joy. And Pastor continues on here in verse 72 to say, I can look back now, and I can see when I was 17 years old, and I kept wondering, why is this, just absolutely taking over my life? Why is it so interesting, and why can't I get my mind off of it and onto the pleasurable things of life like everyone else? Okay, so Pastor can remember when he was a young man, 17 years old, how he had this burning desire, okay, this great joy in seeking after the knowledge of Yahweh, the wisdom and understanding that comes from Yahweh's laws, actually studying the Scriptures. He goes on here in verse 73 to say, and when I was in college a few hundred years ago, laughing, I would be studying when the other guys were out, playing around town. And one night I went out with them. They kept begging me to go, and I went out with them, and we did some pretty stupid, foolish things, and this haunted me. I thought, man, I just wasted a whole night, and I could never get it back. It was just totally wasted because I didn't stay there at that great library that we had at the college and study. But it was eating me up. It was something, it was my biggest love in life, and I can see how Yahweh had brought that down from Abraham to this generation and placed it in me as well, to where this would be the most interesting thing in my life. This would be the bird that I would want to find and point, that it was just geared in that direction for me, and with this I had control over it. I could go the other way, but I didn't want to go the other way. I wanted to learn what was in the Holy Scriptures. Okay, and Pastor's referencing about the bird dogs, which he covered a little bit in verse 67, showing about how, the dogs all came from one species, like all mankind came from two people, but certain dogs through breeding, have actually been trained where you have certain dogs that are more inclined to, do bird hunting, to actually, point in the direction of where the birds are at, and to actually have this desire to go after, birds. And some dogs are trained for different things. Some are trained for people who have seeing impairments, and some are trained for, searching things and sniffing things out. But what Pastor was showing here is how this inspiration, okay, this implementation through the genetics was actually passed down thousands of years, okay, where it actually came down to old 1934, and when Pastor was born, that these things were actually placed within him. If you remember, he talks a lot about how his mother made it a constant habit of studying the Scriptures daily and reading to the children the Scriptures daily, and this actually energized this love that him and Jacob had for the Scriptures. And he shows here how, even when he was 17 years old, it'd bother him if he went and wasted time instead of sitting and studying, where he had the opportunity to study there at a great library at one of the colleges he went to. But if we continue on here to verse 280, And this is on page 280 in verse 81, I'm sorry. And we're continuing to look here about the genes, okay, and this genetic encoding, which actually was placed and gets carried down from one generation to the next. And if you look here in verse 80 on page 280, it says, "Well, here a son succeeding in the father's calling, or in his genes, what was placed from the father to the son, a successor," in other words, succeeding, a successor. Remember those words because they're important as you come down to the line of Yeshua and the prophecies that point or show us who the Savior was and what he was to do, and certain aspects of his life. Remember, a son succeeding to a father's calling, or to what was placed in the father's mind, what he loved and appreciated, the son loved and appreciated it too. And remember this now, the father does not actually breed everything. What comes out in the son is not necessarily all the things that have been placed there by his immediate father. Because things that are coming to you right now actually started in the days of Abraham and did this same line, and the same line of genes, billions of them. Did you see them on the film? Billions of them in every cell. Okay, so we can see that we're not just made up of what we inherited from our parents or even our grandparents. The pastor shows here thousands of years, these things have been passed down, to where Yahweh actually, there was something that he called us with that kind of clicked the light on in our head. We actually had this desire to learn and to absorb this knowledge that comes from Yahweh's laws. Okay, and these genes that are being passed to and coming to you right now actually started in the days of Abraham and the same line of genes. Okay, so you can see that Yahweh's plan, that's why it's so important, and we're going to see this as we continue on here, why it's so important for us to guard and keep. Remember the job of a priest, and Yahweh's training us to be priests in his kingdom, to guard and keep Yahweh's way. Okay, guard and keep Yahweh's way, because it's very important that we only have our focus and feed our mind, as we read there earlier about it depends what we feed our mind, to whether our mind will deteriorate or actually to where we'll build up our mind. We have to be feeding our mind righteousness. We have to be feeding our mind morality. Okay, if not, then we actually store things into our minds, which are going to go into our genetics and going to be passed on to our children, to our offspring, and to their children. Now here in verse 90 on page 281, this is verse 90 on page 281. It says, he read Genesis 18 verse 7, which says, Abraham ran to the herd, took a tender fattened calf. Well, this is the same thing Yeshua meant, the same kind of reference this word is following here. Then he says, it's followed, and he's reading here from the Hebrew English lexicon of the Old Testament. If you look in verse 84, he's reading from the Hebrew English lexicon of the Old Testament by Brown, Drivers, and Briggs on page 121, okay, showing what we read here in Yachanan 3:13. But he says, it's followed by the word of quality and characteristics. So we see in his speaking here of the sons who walk by the side of Yahweh, or the priests who walk by the side of Yahweh. It's actually speaking of those of a certain breeding or tribe whose bloodline is guarded and so forth. Okay, so we see here the sons or priests who walk by the side of Yahweh is actually speaking of those of a certain breeding whose bloodline is guarded. And then he says this also means anointed ones, and he points to Genesis 15:2, sons of possession or sons of inheritance. So this goes back to showing what Yeshua is talking about here, and goes to showing the same thing we learned all the way up to this time. So we see that the quality and characteristics, okay, and we see here it's speaking of the sons who walk by the side of Yahweh. Now if you skip over to verse 99, on page 281 and verse 99, it says, so this is somewhat what you're going to see in the kingdom of Yahweh. Except the lowest slaves, as Yahweh shows, will actually be very, very joyous at that time because they won't be oppressed. There won't be oppression in the kingdom of Yahweh. But there will be guidance and there will be love, and the brotherhood that Yahweh shows between a slave and the owner of the slaves will still exist and the 144,000 remnants that will possess the kingdom that were promised to inherit. Okay, so we have to remember that there won't be oppression in the kingdom Yahweh. There's going to be guidance and love. As we are training to be rulers of the kingdom of Yahweh. Remember, not rulers like, a ruler where you're smushing down and pushing down on someone, but remember what Pastor said, this rulership is a servant too. Just like Yahweh. Yahweh is our ruler. Pastor is our ruler. It's service and it's servant. Service and service to the people. Those under your authority and direction. But we won't be oppressing. Okay, there won't be oppression in the kingdom of Yahweh. There's going to be guidance and love, and true love. Not the love that we see in the world, which is actually unlawful lust that's promoted as love, but it's going to be true love and teaching and training and setting things in the order of Yahweh's laws so that everyone who is living and learning is going to be able to experience the great blessings and benefits that come through keeping Yahweh's laws. We see how that's been totally twisted in Christianity today to where, true love has been turned away from, and this Hollywood image of love has been promoted, or, this Christianized image of love, and there's no guidance. It's just do whatever feels right in your own heart, or whatever's consenting between two adults, do what feels good. These are the different sayings and things that are pushed and promoted. And then so we see the breaking down of the bodies and the breaking down of the minds and the actual oppression and misery that comes from turning away from the righteous guidance and love that Yahweh requires us to show for our fellow man. And for those that we haven't even met. There's many who are going to come to Yahweh's house that we haven't even met or had the opportunity to communicate with. And we actually right now are showing the love towards them by building in our genetics this desire for guarding and keeping Yahweh's way and following righteousness. Now, continuing on here in verse 100, remember what we read in verse 90 about the sons of priests who walk by the side of Yahweh is actually speaking of those of a certain breeding whose bloodline is guarded. Okay? It's talking about this... those who walk by the side of Yahweh there in verse 90. And then if we go down to verse 100, it says, okay, this is what this phrase, son of a messenger, means. Having dominion or rule. Now the Hebrew tongue restored shows that because they persevere in Yahweh's will, this was given because they persevere or have, this line of breeding to where they're geared, and then they yield to it and beg for more and learn to love it and so forth. So they preserve in Yahweh's way. And that's what this word means in walking with Yahweh or by the side of Yahweh. Okay, so to yield to walk with Yahweh, or to walk by the side of Yahweh means to yield to his way, to beg for more, to learn to love it, and preserve in it. And this is what we're training to do right now. This is what Pastor is showing us how to do, in the fact of, we might not have the same desire towards studying or towards building in Yahweh's righteousness. Okay, and so we actually have to make a day-to-day effort, to get our thoughts focused on Yahweh's way. Get our thoughts focused on learning Yahweh's laws, learning Yahweh's plan, because, if you remember in 1 Corinthians 1:26 talks about Yahweh not calling many wise or many noble, but he calls the least, the lowest, and to make them great, and he'll make what's great the lowest. Well, our minds, are horribly screwed up in these last days, as Pastor's shown us many times, because of the continuation of sin and its vicious cycle. Remember now, Pastor was born in 1934. When he was 17 years old, he had this great desire for Yahweh's plan. Well, nowadays, or you go back, 10, 20 years, children are born into a different lifestyle, as we've seen before, where it talks about even in the school systems now, we're seeing children growing up in the school systems in the world and society today who are actually children of, they're actually the result of the breeding of parents who grew up with video games and movies as their like all-time thing. Years ago when Pastor grew up, his parents and his grandparents and they didn't have those kinds of pulls and lusts and things to get their minds all twisted off into foolishness. What we see nowadays where the mind is already 10 steps back at birth because of a lack of training throughout society, a lack of training in morality. So instead of training to learn and to love to understand knowledge and to grow, there's been a push for entertaining, to entertain, to spend your time doing things that are pleasurable. Pastor read it here. He said when the other guys were out in town playing around, he would be sitting and studying. And he used to wonder, in verse 72, he says, he used to wonder why it's so interesting, the scriptures, and learning Yahweh's way, and why he can't get his mind off of it and onto the pleasurable things of life like everybody else. Well, everyone else has managed successfully under Satan's direction and control to go after the pleasurable things of life. And that's what is pushed into mankind today, and this is what we see our children being born into, where they have, just starting off, without any kind of negative influence. They don't have to go to public school, and they don't have to be watching movies and television, but you can see that carnal desire is very strong. And Yeshua prophesied those things. He said sin was going to reach its peak. And it's up to us, men and young men, it's up to us to actually create a burning desire in our minds to love Yahweh's way, to desire Yahweh's way and nothing else. Not the pleasurable things of the world, but to love Yahweh's way and to build upon this so that we will actually be able to walk with Yahweh or walk by the side of Yahweh. Okay? And that's the only thing that's worth, pushing for. That's an eternal, forever position, that is actually offered to us, the seeds of Yisrayl, okay, that we're actually offered to be able to walk with Yahweh or by the side of Yahweh, which means that we'll be yielding to his way, we're begging for more, to learn, to love it, and to preserve in it. Now, if we go over here to verse 116, in closing here, in verse 116, Pastor's going to show us here about what we have to get our minds off of here. Now he says here, in verse 115, he says the word domination means exercising of power and ruling, and then the word bent, B-E-N-T, according to the same source, means strongly inclined towards something, so as to be resolved, determined, bound, or set, inclination in a particular direction, tendency, or function. Now he says, now please keep that in mind in verse 116 on page 284. Now please keep that in mind, that this don't mean you don't have to govern yourself and make up your mind to do righteousness. You must. Okay, it's a must. You must. Otherwise, if you yield to sin, and the more you yield to sin, the more you yield to it, the easier it will be to yield to it. And then pretty soon your conscience becomes, as one of the prophets said, seared with a hot iron, to where you won't even pay attention to the evil you're doing because you're geared in this direction now. So this desire that Yahweh put there to yield you in a certain direction. Okay, and if you remember Genesis 4 verse 7, Yahweh showed us that desire to sin is with us, but we must overcome it. Remember he told this to Cain, the desire to sin is with you, but you must overcome it, because that's the way mankind was made, with this desire to go on their own, lust and to fulfill their own desires. That desire is there, but it's possible to overcome it. It's actually very possible, and it just takes that effort that we have to put forth. So this desire Yahweh put there to yield you in a certain direction, this inclination to yield you in a certain direction or tendency to go in a certain way, then leaves you. Because you have yielded this number of times, so that the tendency then becomes yielding to evil instead of fighting against it. This is where you need to repent and do some fasting and praying that Yahweh will forgive you and get your mind back to thinking properly according to Spirit holy and not unholy spirit. So we have to, this is why the scripture tells us for each of us to examine ourselves, to examine ourselves and see where it is that we're falling short, okay? and to see maybe in which ways we're allowing ourselves to yield, to sin in any way, and that we would repent bitterly and get these things out of our lives so that we can be able to get our minds thinking properly according to Spirit holy and not unholy spirit. But now, Pastor says here in verse 121, he says, so we see then that those who walk at Yahweh's side are those who are predisposed to bend or yield to Yahweh's will and who persevere in it. This is innate, that is bred into them. All of these things shown in this one little Hebrew word, like this whole big dictionary that goes into one gene. And he says, we'll pick up with this. Remember where we left off. We'll pick up with it next time. Until then, may Yahweh bless your understanding, and I'll turn the services back to the song leader. And just in closing here, we're going to read the quote there at the bottom of the page. It says, so we see then that those who walk at Yahweh's side are those who are predisposed to bend or yield to Yahweh's will and who persevere in it. This is innate, that is bred into them. Okay? And man, let us continue to yield ourselves to Yahweh's way, to actually long after it, to actually desire it, to beg for more, to learn to love it so we can persevere in this way, so we will be able to walk at the side of Yahweh and walk with Yahweh and be able to actually fulfill what is written, of man being made higher than the Malachim, which we see in Yeshua. Yeshua sits at Yahweh's right hand, and we actually have the opportunity to actually be a part of Yahweh's ruling, governing authority for all eternity, following His guidance from His laws and from the teachings that we receive from His messenger.